Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage 2016 AERA President Vivian Gadsden.
Thank you. Good evening. I am Vivian Gadsden, President of the American Educational Research Association, AERA. On behalf of AERA, I welcome all of you joining us here at the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center, and the hundreds and more watching us online. To this, the 13th Annual Brown Lecture in Education Research. For those of you tweeting tonight's event, the hashtag is AERA Brown Lecture. As a courtesy to our speaker and all of our guests, we ask that attendees please silence their cell phones. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with AERA, the American Educational Research Association was founded in 1916 and is currently celebrating its centennial year. AERA is the largest national scientific and scholarly society dedicated to advancing knowledge about education, to encouraging scholarly inquiry related to education, and to promoting the use of research to improve education and to serve the public good. AERA publishes the top-ranked journals in the field and strives to make trusted knowledge widely accessible to diverse public and policy communities. Let me take this opportunity to invite all of you to attend the 2017 annual meeting in San Antonio this coming April. The meeting theme this year is Knowledge to Action, Achieving the Promise of Equal Educational Opportunity. This theme, in almost all respects, reflects the heart and soul of the Brown Lecture. As with this gathering, the annual meeting will provide a prime opportunity for education researchers to focus on the importance of equal opportunity while highlighting the significance of rigorous research for improving opportunity and access. In 2004, AERA inaugurated what has become known around the country as the Brown Lecture, not only to commemorate the US Supreme Court's landmark decision in Brown v. Board of Education, but also to acknowledge that the best and boldest of social scientists at the time were bringing innovative ideas and methods to efforts to understand the persistent problems of racial inequality in society. So the Brown Lecture is an annual reminder of the important role that research can play in advancing equality in education. Tonight's lecture would not be possible without the generous support of the 16 Friends of the Brown Lecture. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge them and their incredible generosity. The Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the American Anthropological Association, the American Institutes for Research, the American Political Science Association, the American Sociological Association, the American Statistical Association, the Association for the Study of Higher Education, the Eastern Sociological Society, Educational Testing Service, George Washington University Graduate School of Education and Human Development, RAND, the Russell Sage Foundation, Sage Publications, the Spencer Foundation, University of Maryland College of Education, and my own beloved institution, the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education. Thank you, our friends, for your continued commitment and support. I would also like to acknowledge and thank the Brown Lectures Committee for its work. The committee is chaired by Kofi Lomote. It also included AERA Executive Director Felice Levine, AERA Immediate Past President Jeannie Oakes, AERA Director of Professional Development and Diversity Officer George Wimberly, AERA members Denise Ward Hood and Lisa Bass, and myself. And now I invite Kofi Lomote, Distinguished Professor of Educational Leadership at Western Carolina University and Chair of the AERA Social Justice Action Committee, to introduce this year's Distinguished Brown Lecturer. Kofi?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As chair of the selection committee, I am honored to introduce our 2016 Brown Lecture presenter. On behalf of the selection committee and the officers, leaders, and members of AERA, it is with great pleasure that I formally introduce Dr. Marta Tienda. The Brown Lecture was created to illuminate the role of research in advancing our knowledge and understanding of equality and equity in education. Each year, we have presented a distinguished and thought-provoking scholar as our Brown Lecturer. During a contentious election cycle where immigration, poverty, and education are among the many politicized issues facing the U.S., it is vital to hear a voice like Marta Tienda's. Dr. Tienda is a leading scholar on immigration, population diversification, and poverty, and on the roles they play in the provision of access to education. At Princeton University, Dr. Tienda is the Maurice P. During 1922 Professor in Demographic Studies and Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs, with joint affiliations in the Office of Population Research and the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. From 1998 until 2002, she served as director of the Office of Population Research, and in 2002, she served as president of the Population Association of America. She previously held appointments at the University of Chicago and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. For more than 40 years, Dr. Tienda has been an invaluable contributor to the field of sociology. She is the co-author or co-editor of 8 books and has produced more than 200 scientific papers and book chapters addressing U.S. racial and ethnic inequality, international migration, variations in family structure and reproductive behavior, and access to higher education. Dr. Tienda is a member of the White House Commission on Educational Excellence for Hispanics, the National Research Council Panel on Economic and Fiscal Consequences of Immigration, and the Mellon Foundation Advisory Committee on Our Common Interests. She is an AERA Fellow and a Fellow of the National Academy of Education, the American Academy of Political and Social Science, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Dr. Tienda is eminently qualified to examine public education and the social contract. She can best illuminate why achieving the promise of Brown is inextricably linked to future generations inheriting an educational legacy likely to render the dream of a more perfect union. Please join me in welcoming the 2016 Brown Lecture and Education Research speaker, Dr. Marta Tienda.
Good evening, and thank you for sharing time with us. I'd like to acknowledge my assistant, Kara Carpenito, who has spent an enormous amount of time supporting me in preparing slides, and a fantastic graduate student at Princeton, Joel Middleman, who somebody here will definitely be lucky enough to hire in the short term. A couple disclaimers. I'm a beneficiary of public education, K through 12, all the way through graduate school. Growing up, I knew my father that despite his poverty wages and 3 years of formal schooling, always voted for increased millages for school taxes. I'm delighted today to talk to you about the social contract in education, and I'll begin with the short summary report, a status report of where the United States stands today, and then move into a discussion of education as a fundamental right. I will then discuss the legacies of local control that have tried to challenge that fundamental right and how difficult it is to realize, and then describe 3 missed opportunities that this nation faced to make education a fundamental right. I'll conclude with a rather bold suggestion about a possibility for restoring the social contract. Since the beginning of the 19th century, the United States led the world in literacy, and through the end of World War II also ranked first in the percentage of the school-age children enrolled in school. Another remarkable development is becoming the first nation to deliver universal high school education to its citizens. Its steadfast commitment to cultivating skills in response to changing market needs powered economic growth and individual prosperity. By 1950, only 6.2% of the US population ages 25 and over was college educated, but that share quadrupled to over 1 in 4 over the next 50 years. But the United States now ranks 12th among 34 industrial peers in college degree attainment. To illustrate the erosion in the US post-secondary standing internationally, this figure compares the shares of college-educated 24 to 34-year-olds in 1910 with 55 to 64-year-olds, that outsized baby boom cohorts, who were in their mid-20s and 30s in 1980. This cohort comparison illustrates how much today's youth have advanced in college completion relative to seniors. That the triangle and the square for the United States overlap indicates stagnation in college attainment. By comparison, the share of college-educated 25 to 34-year-olds in the UK and Japan rose and now match the United States. South Korea, Canada, and Russia's rates rose faster and now exceed the US average. I signal Canada and Korea to underscore similarities and differences that can be used as excuses for US slippage: population heterogeneity and aging, neither of which undermine their steadfast commitments to investments in education. Korea's ascendance to high education standing is particularly instructive. If the initial impetus for educational investments was economic development and self-improvement following the devastating war, what remains today that still serves the national interest is a socio-political commitment to the ethic of education, one that serves both individual and societal goals. Both Canada and Israel have much larger foreign-born population shares than the United States, yet this has not damaged their college attainment rates. Rather, just the opposite. Moreover, unlike the United States, which was one of only 6 countries to cut public spending on education between 2008 and 2011, the much faster aging Korean and Japanese governments did not sacrifice educational investments for spending on seniors. I return to this point in my concluding comments. Except for a spurt of news coverage, The OECD report fell like a tree in the forest. On international math and science tests, U.S. students score below the OECD average because their relative performance deteriorates as they progress through the education system. Today, even students from middle-income countries outshine the United States in math and science. Based on the most recent assessments, less than 10% of U.S. students qualified as top math performers, which compares with nearly 1/3 of Korean, 16% of Canadian, and 12% of British students. The superior performance of Chinese students in both science and math should set off alarms, as occurred when the Russians launched Sputnik in 1957. Unfortunately, reports showing that the United States is falling behind its economic competitors are met with public indifference at best and bureaucratic regulations at worst. Family income remains one of the most significant and predictors of scholastic achievement. This was not always the case. Had it been, I would not be here today. Evidence that over the past 30 years, the test score gap between high and low-income students grew about 40% between students in the 10th and 90th percentages of the income distribution has also not generated a public outcry commensurate to that following the release of the report, A Nation at Risk. This yawning achievement disparity is comparable to the gap between 8th and 4th graders. Why the indifference? Why no call to action? Behind the dismal U.S. academic performance, I believe, is a growing tolerance for inequality along income and class lines, as if this were part of a new natural order. Notwithstanding the profound social and legal significance of the 1954 Brown decision, America's schools continue to segregate students by race and poverty status. Currently, 1 in 6 students in the K-12 system attend highly segregated, under-resourced schools that are staffed with less experienced teachers and fail to offer advanced coursework. What's more, the segregation is rising. Between 2001 and 2014, the percentage of K-12 schools in which 75% of the students are both low-income and Hispanic or African American rose 7 percentage points. The Brown decision, despite its powerful influence in exposing entrenched school segregation, ultimately permitted dismantling de jure segregation. However, it has proven inadequate to challenge de facto segregation by social class, across school districts, or assignment policies. The nation's slippage on the international arena, coupled with rising school segregation, is deeply rooted in a system of local control, which has been difficult to square with the philosophical goal of equal opportunity. This is particularly so given the nation's social, economic, and regional diversity, which adds strength and vitality on the one hand and provides ready-made fault lines for divisions in educational opportunity on the other. I argue that the federal government has been complicit in aggravating educational inequality by not making free public education a fundamental guarantee during propitious political moments, by enabling the creation of a segregated public higher education system, by relegating the Department of Education and its predecessors to a secondary status in the federal administration, which compromised its enforcement capacity, and by proliferating incremental reforms while ignoring the unequal institutional arrangements that undermine equal opportunity. History shows that a strong federal role can strengthen the educational social contract and offers important lessons going forward. In thinking about why the U.S. is losing ground educationally, despite spending per pupil and volumes of litigation to broaden access to college, I was struck by an article in The Atlantic by Stephen Lurie titled, "Why Doesn't the U.S. Guarantee the Right to Education?" This is something I had taken for granted and never really questioned. After all, the Supreme Court has been involved in many decisions contesting access to higher education. And even before the Brown decision, Herman Sweat sued the University of Texas after he was denied admission to the law school. Invoking the Equal Protection Clause, the court ruled in his favor. UT set up a separate law school for one person. In fact, the U.S. Constitution does not support substantive equality. The men who penned the historic document made no provision for a federal role in creating the educated citizenry that presumably was essential for democracy to flourish. How could they possibly contemplate equal educational opportunity at a time when the system of ascriptive democracy recognized free white men? Surprisingly, the terms equal or equality are only mentioned in Articles 1, 2, and 5 of the Constitution in reference to equal representation of the states in the Congress. Nor does the nation's educational social contract reside in the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, which ironically has been used to uphold wealth-based disparities in public education financing. The principle of federalism articulated in the 10th Amendment decrees states responsible for the design and financing of public education systems. This means that U.S. school children lack a fundamental right to equal education and that children's rights to education is lodged in 50 state constitutions. Even without a fundamental right to education, the decentralized U.S. educational framework served the nation very well during the 19th and early 20th century. Compared to other European nations, the United States was an innovator in the educational arena in myriad ways, including the early move to public funding, high investments relative to the nation's prosperity, and an emphasis on basic skills in core curricula, and at least partially lack of tracking for different classes of students, except for blacks, who were largely denied access. These innovations and investments paid off handsomely by energizing the engines of economic growth and promoting mobility as urbanization and industrialization gained momentum. That was then, before matters about access to quality education became contested terrain. Lurie's Atlantic article points out that all countries that currently outrank the United States in educational achievement either have a statutory guarantee to a free education or an independent statute guaranteeing education as a basic right. A constitutional amendment is highly unlikely in the current age of deep political division and growing fragmentation along regional and ethnic lines. So this raises a broad question. What would it take to galvanize the nation around the goals of reclaiming educational supremacy? There is no magic bullet, particularly since the legal authority is situated in state constitutions and deeply baked in cultures of local control with lasting consequences for educational inequality. Several scholars have adroitly chronicled the history of the common school movement that drove the expansion of primary schools. For a relatively young nation, providing free access to education financed by local taxes remains an impressive achievement. Relative to its economic status and also by comparison to mature European nations, the United States demonstrated an unusual propensity to invest in education. Moreover, as industrialization raised the skills needed to earn a living beyond those provided by the common school education, communities responded by creating secondary schools. In addition to providing broad access to working class and poor students alike, the common schools were distinctive in their emphasis on basic skills. On the one hand, though, local control of public education enabled taxation and encouraged experimentation. On the other hand, it also engendered and gradually cemented resistance to federal interference, much less regulation. Decentralized educational authority benefited from the weak federal apparatus to regulate schools since the late 19th century. The history of the Department of Education instantiates the tension between the states and the central government to regulate instructional content and school funding. Following a transitory one-year existence in the aftermath of the Civil War, the Federal Department of Education was demoted to an office within the Department of Interior, and like a child in foster care, subsequently shuffled across agencies within the Interior and Defense Departments until it regained cabinet status as part of the Department of Health and Education and Welfare. Failed attempts by reformers to create a standalone department reinforced the tension between central and local control. Thus, between 1869 and 1953, those vital years for the expansion of public education, there was limited federal oversight. The Eisenhower administration restored education to cabinet status, but by locating the unit in a tripartite department that included health and human services, assured limited influence. By then, the legacy of local control was firmly entrenched, so much so that the courts became the primary recourse for challenging disparities in the interest of equalizing opportunity. In the Southwest, for example, numerous districts sued for discriminatory practices. But because Mexicans were classified as white by law, if not in practice, none of the suits gained traction. The Mendez case in California was particularly instructive. Although school officials shamelessly justified the discriminatory practices alleging Mexicans' inferior, quote, hygiene, ability, and economic outlook, unquote, California law did not explicitly designate Mexicans as a racial group for purposes of de jure segregation, only Native Americans, Japanese, Chinese, or Mongolians. This less well-known case laid the groundwork for the Brown decision, which ruled against de jure racial segregation. How deeply unequal educational opportunity is enshrined in the decentralized governance system is not widely appreciated, except perhaps by legal scholars and litigators, and of course the policy wonks dedicated to exposing and funding achievement disparities across and within states. Two noteworthy developments bear on the contemporary contours of inter- and intrastate educational inequality. First, despite varied levels of resistance to levying taxes for establishing and operating public schools, decentralization allowed counties and townships to compete and control the content of education. The coincidence of the common school movement with industrialization and economic growth facilitated the expansion of primary and secondary schools, albeit unevenly between the northern and western states on the one hand and the southern states on the other. That legacy persists today. Second, support for public schools appears to be higher in locations with lower levels of inequality and demographic heterogeneity. Population homogeneity facilitated communities' ability to overcome collective action problems because, according to Black and Sokoloff, neighbors understood that taxation not only benefited their children, but also others like themselves. This included immigrants from Western and Northern Europe whose cultural affinities were perceived to be similar to the initial settlers. Support for public school waned as immigration streams shifted to Southern and Eastern Europe during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Strong taxpayer support for publicly funded secondary schools in the Heartland state lends supports for claims that demographic heterogeneity undermined public support for education, but from the opposite direction. Not only were the Heartland states more ethnically homogeneous through the early 20th century, but with greater reliance on agriculture and lower urbanization levels, economic differences within and between communities were smaller. Claims about the association between population heterogeneity, economic inequality, and support for public education, while not causal, are worrisome in light of the rise of inequality and demographic diversity since 1970. If decentralized school finance served the early republic well in garnering tax levies to support public education, a deleterious legacy is the persistence of inter- and intrastate disparities in per-pupil expenditures, especially in the South and in states serving large minority populations. Funding disparities rooted in norms of local control were nurtured in the absence of any strong regulatory apparatus, either at the state or local level. I don't mean to imply that higher spending improves learning, that the United States ranks near the top in per-student spending, but returns to that spending pale by comparison to our industrialized peers. In part, this is because the share allocated to teaching declined since 1970 as administrative costs rose. Still, there's agreement that under-resourced schools are less well-equipped to deliver quality education compared with affluent schools. Advances in economic prosperity permitted increases in public funding between 1880 and 1930. Interstate variation in per-pupil expenditures narrowed. Not only did the ratio of minimum and maximum per-pupil expenditures drop from 11.7 to 9.5, but the coefficient of variation, which is a distribution-free measure of dispersion around the mean, also fell 10 points, indicating a reduction of funding inequality between states. Interstate variation in public funding levels fell further over the next 30 years, which endured the Great Depression and a punishing war. By 1960, the coefficient of variation was nearly half, but increasingly increased slightly by 1990, and over the next dozen years rose 6 points as state districts balanced their budgets by slashing school revenues. Over the past 125-year period, the correlation between state per-pupil expenditure and percent Black fell from minus 0.64 to less than minus 0.1, presumably enabled by the dismantling of de jure segregation. That would be heartening news were it not for the fact that today the correlation between per pupil expenditures and percent poor is strong and negative. At minus 0.60, it mimics the association between race and average student expenditure in 1880. This is a troubling development in light of rising income inequality since the mid-1970s. Regional variation in economic prosperity altered the composition of low expenditure states over time. This graph identifies the states with per pupil expenditures at least one standard deviation above the national average, which for simplicity I'll refer to as the high expenditure states. As early as 1880, the high expenditure states included representatives from both coasts, the Southwest and the Heartland, but not the Deep South. California spent over double the national average and nearly 12 times the average expenditure per student in North Carolina. Over the next 50 years, as average per pupil expenditures more than quadrupled, variation around the mean narrowed. In 1930, states with expanding industrial economies, notably New York, New Jersey, and Michigan, joined California among the high expenditure pool. Per student expenditures rose 228% over the next 30 years, but stagnated thereafter, increasing a meager 5.5% between 1990 and 2012, owing to the deep recessionary cuts. Along with Alaska, New York and New Jersey remained among a handful of states making above average educational expenditures since 1960. Here it is, the ice. The legacy of decentralization exacted the largest toll in the South, where segregation exacerbated funding disparities between schools serving white and black children. In 1880, 9 of the 10 low expenditure states were in the South. That year, North Carolina had the lowest per pupil expenditure, a meager 18% of the national average. With per pupil educational expenditures 75% below the national average, Georgia qualified for last place in 1930. Mississippi and Arkansas shortchanged students with below average investments in every period, and 4 states, Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, and Kentucky, did so in 4 out of the 5 periods. Since 1960, though, no state has committed less than 58% of the per pupil national average. Moreover, the number of low expenditure states fell to 8 in 1990 and 5 in 2012. The state averages, however, conceal large interstate disparities across districts. Just to illustrate, this chart summarizes per pupil funding disparities between high and low minority districts and between high and low poverty districts among those 5 low expenditure states in 1912. At the national level, average per pupil expenditures were 15.6% lower in high poverty compared with low poverty districts, but only 4.4% lower in districts serving large minority populations. Furthermore, funding disparities between high poverty and high minority districts do not vary in a consistent manner. In southern states, per pupil outlays were modestly higher in the poorest compared to the richest districts, but the dollar amounts involved are trivial. Among 4 out of the 5 low expenditure states, per pupil spending favors districts with serving large minority districts, but the funding advantage is very modest in Mississippi and Oklahoma. The story is equally mixed in the high expenditure states, except that funding disparities are generally higher. That the list of high expenditure states includes New Jersey and New York partly reflects funding commitments in response to litigation seeking remedy for interstate disparities. Both before and after the historic Brown decision, the courts became the center stage for redressing egregious school funding disparities. Generally known for the quality of its schools, Connecticut provides a dramatic recent example of high expenditure state where affluent and poor districts co-reside in close proximity. So large are the disparities that Bridgeport students underperform poor students in Mississippi and Arkansas. In deciding a long-standing lawsuit challenging the state school finance system, the state Superior Court judge concluded, quote, Connecticut is defaulting on its constitutional duty to provide an adequate education. It is a case to watch because rather than offer a narrow remedy tailored to the Bridgeport district, by allowing the state to pour money into the problem, he requested a full revamping of the state school financing plan. The 1973 San Antonio ISD versus Rodriguez decision exposed the gaping holes in the U.S. educational social contract, better said, contracts based on property values. The 5-4 ruling opined that education is not a fundamental right, both because the U.S. Constitution delegates that right to the states, which it does, and because the Equal Protection Clause does not apply to cases of relative deprivation, including those based on admittedly large funding disparities between districts and between schools. By building on the complaint around school financing, the plaintiffs inadvertently derailed arguments away from the core issues of equal opportunity to learn. Justice Powell, who 5 years later would pen the Bakke decision, recognizing the educational benefits of a diverse student body, supported the state's claim that every child had a minimally adequate education. Dissenting Judge Marshall characterized the decision as a retreat from our historic commitment to equality of educational opportunity. In some ways, the Rodriguez decision tempers optimism that Connecticut will strengthen education as a fundamental right by revamping its school finance system. However, the silver lining in Rodriguez is in drawing attention to the seemingly unremarkable concept of educational adequacy. The concept gained considerable traction after the 1983 report, A Nation at Risk, which linked inadequacy in delivery and the content of education with the nation's eroding educational performance. Importantly, the scathing report undermined congressional push to dissolve the Department of Education and, for better or worse, fostered the rise of accountability initiatives that now dominate federal oversight. Despite the long-standing tensions between central and local control of schools, there have been several propitious opportunities to strengthen the federal role in public education beyond mere supplementation of state initiatives, so that, short of a constitutional amendment, equal opportunity would approximate a fundamental right. These include the Moral Acts of 1862 and 1880, the National Defense Education Act of 1958, and the Education and Secondary Education Act, which has been reauthorized several times since initially enacted. Each offers opportunities for renewing the social contract, restoring educational opportunity for the working classes, and reclaiming international prominence in education. The expansion of publicly funded higher education in the latter third of the 19th century is a remarkable development because it occurred during the Civil War and because the federal government had a direct hand in creating what became the backbone of the nation's intellectual infrastructure. The 1862 Morrill Act donated public land to incentivize states to establish at least one college dedicated to teaching agricultural and mechanical arts. And the 1890 Morrill Act forged a unique partnership with states by appropriating matching funds for the public colleges, contingent on not denying emancipated blacks admission. By permitting the creation of a parallel higher education system for African Americans, the 1890 institutions, in order to circumvent the discrimination proviso, the federal government was complicit in fomenting pervasive educational segregation. For purposes of higher education, federal legislation authorized two social contracts, one for whites and one for blacks. Currently, there is at least one land-grant institution in every state and territory, including the District of Columbia. What started as a system of colleges to educate the industrial class drove the innovation economy and in the process evolved into a nationwide system of excellent public research and comprehensive universities. Today, public research universities educate about 20% of all post-secondary students. As with K-12 schooling, the imprint of federalism is clearly evident in the uneven state commitments to public higher education. By comparison to K-12 school funding, higher education seldom commands media attention, save periods when controversial issues such as affirmative action are under consideration. Unfortunately, the very institutions that catapulted the United States to international economic preeminence today face unprecedented funding pressures. Although the land-grant institutions initially charged no tuition, unlike K-12 education, higher education was never a universal access guarantee. In response to rising costs, institutions initially set low tuition rates, increasing them gradually at first and more substantially in recent years. In 1990, state and local appropriations comprised over 1/3 of operating revenue for public institutions, but this share fell to 20% in 2010. Currently, higher education is the third priority in general fund budgets, behind K-12 education and Medicaid. Following the huge cuts in the wake of the Great Recession, tuition became the principal revenue source for many public institutions. Between 2000 and 2012, for example, state appropriations declined a whopping 34% per full-time equivalent student. The twin pressures of falling state and local appropriations and rising tuition means that families now shoulder a much larger share of college costs. In the 1970s, when state appropriations covered 60% of the cost of attending a public university, out-of-pocket costs for families averaged 33%. Now, the family share is 50% of a much higher tuition bill. To make up for budget shortfalls, public universities have also intensified recruitment of out-of-state students, thus rendering public education a private good. By weakening the higher education social contract, states are curtailing social and economic mobility for decades to come. Lessons from the Cold War bring this point into sharp relief. A second propitious moment for strengthening the educational social contract occurred in the context of the Cold War, when Russia's launch of Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite, triggered a crisis of confidence. Seen as evidence that the Soviet schools offered superior training in math and science, within a year Congress passed the National Defense Education Act, NDAA, authorizing close to $1 billion over a 40-year period to improve the capacity of American schools, help meet the nation's security needs. NDAA successfully used the defense rationale to increase states' receptivity to federal involvement in education because of perceptions that the Russians were ahead in the space race, which symbolized military power during the Cold War. If the Eisenhower administration, which also created the Federal Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, laid the foundation for an expanded federal role, it missed a propitious opportunity to make education a fundamental right. Instead, the NDAA legislation guaranteed that each state would maintain control of its own education system. The newly created multi-purpose cabinet-level department did not have the requisite enforcement capacity to monitor the heavy infusion of federal funds into state education agencies. Gamson correctly questions whether the NDAA unintentionally fomented the achievement gaps. He suggests that the hastily drafted legislation also missed a critical opportunity to foster a national conversation about academic ability and to critically examine whether the highly unequal systems of local control were compatible with notions of equal educational opportunity. This was particularly relevant in the wake of the Brown decision. Perhaps the most pernicious unintended consequences of NDAA was the shift to IQ testing for identifying the gifted and talented, and the creation of ability groups as a way of maximizing efficiency in rationing federal funds. Neither testing nor tracking brought clarity to the important distinction between equal educational opportunity and equal outcomes. Flexible general aid with low accountability facilitated creativity and innovation, but dispersed to highly unequal and segregated school systems also fostered many unintended consequences. Although NDAA was not designed to equalize educational opportunity, the requirement of 50% funding matches definitely gave affluent districts a decided advantage. Favorable historical conditions again facilitated federal intrusion into state and local control of public education during the Johnson administration. As the post-war baby boom tested the ability of states to manage overcrowded facilities, resistance to federal aid softened. Master statesman and political strategist Lyndon Johnson made school aid a centerpiece of the Great Society programs, not by using the defense rationale as Lincoln and Eisenhower had done, but instead under the umbrella of the war on poverty. Appealing to the nation's sense of fairness and shame during the period of national mourning, Johnson signed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, the most far-reaching federal legislation ever passed by Congress for education. Given the long-standing resistance to federal involvement in state and local affairs, buttressed by the 10th Amendment, the Act represents a formidable accomplishment, all the more so because it has been renewed multiple times since its enactment, albeit under different names. Reauthorization is not guaranteed. But ESEA also did not advance the cause of making education a fundamental right. Perhaps the time to do so passed after the Cold War ended. That said, ESEA represents an important turning point, establishing the federal government as a full partner to address achievement disparities and working toward the ever more elusive goal of providing equal educational opportunity. Given the large inequities in state and local education systems, Title I was designed to provide supplementary funds to schools serving large numbers of poor children. In practice, Title I funds tend to reward wealthier states because the funding formulas, which multiply the number of eligible students by the average per pupil funding, favor high expenditure states. Spending less to educate low-income students undermines the goal of equalizing educational opportunity. In the short run, this weakness in how Title I funds are allocated can be rectified by revising the formulas to consider the number of poor students in a state. Title I can be further strengthened by providing incentives for expenditure states to equalize per-student investments across the districts. Short of a constitutional amendment, which has zero chance of passing, this change in Title I funding can go some way toward strengthening the education social contract. Notwithstanding popular assertions that an educated citizenry is the backbone of democracy, millions of U.S. children are denied equal educational opportunity. In large measure, this is because the U.S. system of local control limits the hands of policymakers to guarantee an adequate, much less an excellent education. No amount of goal setting and metric-driven assessment schemes can supplant a steadfast commitment to unwind the economic segregation that continues to undermine scholastic achievement. Restoring the United States to educational preeminence is more than a lofty social goal. It is mission critical to sustain the nation's economic competitiveness in a highly globalized world, particularly as the outsized baby boom cohorts retire. Replenishing their formidable human capital stock requires a renewed and vigorous commitment to nation's youth that must begin by restoring educational opportunities that have been eroded through rising income segregation and higher interstate gaps in school expenditures. So I ask, what would it take to summon a call to action comparable to that in response to Sputnik, or a reality check comparable to A Nation at Risk? There are signs of hope and perils in the road ahead, but none insurmountable given a strong commitment to public education as occurred during the Common School movement. The challenges ahead are rendered more difficult in light of the secular rise in income inequality, but that is a poor excuse to justify the disconnect between the philosophy and reality of equal educational opportunity. The rise in income inequality since the late 1970s was largely driven by gains among the wealthiest 20%. Rising inequality translates to lower social mobility and large education achievement gaps. Interstate disparities in school expenditures, which I showed narrowed through the 1970s, also have been on the rise again, enshrining inequality in educational opportunity as a defining feature of unequal school systems. All of the nations that outshine the United States in education metrics have much lower levels of economic inequality and higher levels of social mobility. Given the competitive spirit that drove the nation to economic preeminence, why the complacency among our political leaders? Why is there no public outrage that American students are slipping in math and science performance and that the nation is now ranked 12th in college completion? Moral arguments that high levels of inequality are unjustified in the world's richest nation gain little traction because as a nation we seem to have lost our moral compass on matters of social justice and a shared commitment to the next generation. Balancing state education budgets on the shoulders of future generations, as occurred during the Great Recession, is not only terrible social policy, but also a recipe to compromise the future economic competitiveness of the nation. There are some signs of hope about the prospects of improving educational attainment. For example, it's encouraging that college enrollment rates rose for all segments of the family income distribution since 1965. The bad news, however, is that the college attainment gap between the highest and the lowest family income quartiles doubled over the last 50 years. This results because completion rate of low-income students barely budged, while that of high-income students nearly doubled. College affordability is part of the problem, and unfortunately, most financial aid programs concentrate risk in the lower income gaps. This too can be fixed. In the context of rising income inequality and unequal college rates, the bad economic news is bad economic news because educational attainment is the biggest driver of earnings disparities and intergenerational social mobility. But it is also bad news for seniors because their Social Security and Medicare benefits depend on the earnings of the younger generation. Fortunately, these trends are reversible, but they require a steadfast commitment to restore state support for public institutions. At the K-12 level, the goal of promoting equal educational opportunity under a decentralized education funding regime has proven challenging. Because state-local control of education is deeply entrenched politically and protected by the 10th Amendment, there is no chance that equal educational opportunity will be guaranteed as a fundamental right, at least not in my lifetime. Our deeply divided Congress is not in the mood for passing routine legislation, much less a constitutional amendment. Moreover, districts by district legal skirmishes will never rectify the enormous interstate disparities in educational opportunity nurtured over decades of local control. But given the stakes for the nation, this is no time to acquiesce. It is reasonable to set standards of public education funding and academic quality below which no school should ever fall, irrespective of the state in which it's located or the social background of the students it serves. There is federal precedent for such social safety nets. Presidents Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson rewrote the social contract for retirees and seniors when they championed Social Security and Medicare, respectively, two programs that had been highly effective in reducing or preventing poverty among seniors. They did not require constitutional amendments to enact the socially transformative legislation. Importantly, neither program is cut during recessions because they are federally funded and, unlike the states, the federal government can run a deficit. What's more, AARP has become a powerful watchdog for seniors' rights, effectively lobbying for the social, medical, and economic interests of this growing demographic. By contrast, and unfortunately, the major programs serving young people, most notably education, are state-funded and thus subject to balanced budget constraints. A comparison of the federal outlays for seniors and children brings my point into sharp relief, especially since population aging changed the composition of federal spending on children and seniors. Before Johnson's historic ESEA legislation, less than 3% of federal spending was targeted to children and a respectable 11% to seniors. Medicare was Johnson's legacy program for seniors and is contingent on qualifying for Social Security. Temporal myopia led to underestimates of the long-run funding commitments baked into Medicare, which is an age-based entitlement. As more baby boomers claim their entitlements, their share of the federal budget increases. By contrast, ESEA is renegotiated intermittently, and its provisions are not well targeted to ensure that the federal funds maximally reduce funding disparities among schools and districts. By 2015, 45% of federal spending was for entitlement programs enjoyed by seniors, compared with less than 10% for children. Budget projections indicate that relative expenditures for children will decline even further as all the baby boom cohorts become eligible for Medicare and Social Security. Although these entitlements are not fundamental rights in the narrow sense, they serve as fundamental rights for seniors. Might informed social policy consider a functional equivalent for young people? Just as Social Security establishes a lower income threshold for seniors, the federal government can guarantee a federal threshold below which no state or school can fall. What would it take to renew the educational social contract such that it guarantees all children educational benefits comparable to those offered to seniors by Social Security? Stated differently, how would one go about making quality education an entitlement for all youth? After all, youth do not vote and cannot lobby Congress to reauthorize funding for public education. Let me be provocative. To begin the process and give youth a voice in matters that govern their future, youth advocates should consider a functional equivalent of AARP for children, the American Association for Young People. As the designated champion for promoting a youth-centric policy agenda, ideally they would ensure that the 50 social contracts undergirding unequal educational opportunity are not abrogated and ensure that federal funds are used to reduce intra- and inter-district disparities in educational opportunities. Yet, yes, this is complicated, but U.S. social policy should be up to the challenge. Shame on us if we're not. The United States is overdue for major upgrades in the way it delivers public education because today we face formidable competition from China, a nation with 4 times the population of the United States. China has made massive investments in education, but currently the United States still has a comparative advantage. The advantage is ours to lose. But the biggest challenge is in finding the political will to restore the educational and social contract so that it truly broadens educational opportunity. Nothing short of an astute politician with the courage and political adeptness of LBJ or FDR is needed to champion education policy that genuinely serves all youth. Thank you very much. My regular size. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I can sleep now.
I don't know if you heard that. She said she can sleep now. Thank you, Marta. Those of us who know you know that your contributions to education research have been substantial, and we appreciate the contributions you have made to increasing public awareness, understanding, and appreciation of the need for a renewed national commitment to ensuring equal opportunity to quality education for all. I want to thank you especially for that stimulating and thought-provoking lecture. It was inspiring. We look forward to spreading the word about the webcast of this lecture on the AERA website and to reading the published article in an upcoming 2017 issue of AERA's journal, Educational Researcher. We hope that all of you will plan to attend next year's Brown Lecture, which will be held October 19th, 2017. In addition, next month, AERA will launch a National Centennial Lecture Series featuring education research lectures to be held across the United States from November 2016 through April 2017. The series will feature 6 lectures, with each accompanied by an open discussion forum of policy leaders and scholars. The first lecture will be held in Brooklyn on November 30th. Like tonight's Brown Lecture, all of these lectures will also be live streamed. For more information on speakers and topics, please visit the AERA website. We thank you all for joining us at this important lecture. We invite you to sign the guest book in the foyer, which we will give Marta as a remembrance of this incredible and special occasion. Now we invite you to the reception in the foyer outside this auditorium and to enjoy the evening in the glow of this poignant and inspiring lecture. We are honored to have had you join us this evening, and thank you.